Hello and welcome to the Aussie Car Lovers channel, the channel dedicated to the love of the automobile. The Australian motor vehicle industry is huge, as it is in obviously many parts of the world, but Australia has a much loved cultural heritage of the motor vehicle, and it started with this gentleman that you see on your screen. His name was James Alexander Holden. He emigrated into Australia in 1852 from England, and in 1856 established J.A. Holden and Co., essentially a saddlery business. It wasn't until 25 years later when his son joined him, Henry, and another partner called H.A. Frost, that the company evolved a little more into coach repairs. And not so much coach building at this stage as yet, but they were repairing coaches now for horse-drawn vehicles. It wasn't until 1905 that Edward Holden, who was the grandson of James, joined, and he had an avid interest in automobiles. With now Edward involved, the company now began to design and build its own coaches. At the time, the way it happened was the chassis were built by various companies and imported as well, obviously, and then these chassis were married up to bodies built by other companies. So the customer, let's say, would essentially go to a chassis building company. They would order the chassis, and the chassis would obviously on specifications from the customer, the chassis would be built, and it would include the wheels, motor, the transmission, and the differential, and then this would then be shipped off to the customer's preferred bodybuilding company, and in this case, let's say it was Holden, and then Holden would then in turn build the coach or the body, and this would be trimmed, painted to the specifications of the customer, and be mounted onto the chassis, and then subsequently delivered as a final product to the customer. This really happened in around about 1917, really when the company really took off, and it was due to the wartime trade restrictions that Holden Motor Bodybuilders came into existence, and they specialise now in building bodies, and they did this at 400 King William Street in Adelaide. It was a former company building for F.T. Hack and Co., and they were essentially chassis builders. Holden Motor Bodybuilders took it over, and they erected a 4-storey factory on the site. By 1823, Holden Motor Bodybuilders were producing around about 12,000 units per year. And during this time, they assembled for other companies as well, including Ford, believe it or not. And they were manufacturing at this site for chassis importers, including Austin, Buick, Chevrolet, Cleveland, Dodge, Essex, Fiat, Hudson, Oakland, Oldsmobile, Overland Rio, Studebaker, and Willis Knight, to name a few. Well, there was a lot there, and there was more than that. So really, essentially, they were a bodybuilding company. During this period of time, General Motors Australia was also well and truly established, and had assembly plants in a number of states within Australia. They were using the bodies produced by Holden's, and they would import their own complete knockdown chassis. So they would import their chassis and then marry them up to the Holden bodies. So it became quite a profitable partnership between the two. In 1930 alone, Holden were producing bodies for Austin, Chrysler, DeSoto, Morris, Hillman, Hunter, and Willis. as well as for GM cars. So they had a quite established brand network. The Great Depression of the 1930s led to a substantial downturn in production for Holden and really nearly sent them broke. They were producing at that time up to 34,000 units annually. So you can see from where it went from, in 1856 to a saddlery business to by 1930 producing 34,000 units annually. And in 1930, with the Great Depression, it went from 34,000 down to 1,600. So it was pretty bad. In 1931, really the Holden Motor Body Builders Company was virtually bankrupt. So GM, or General Motors America, purchased the company and merged it to General Motors Australia, forming General Motors Holdens Limited, or as we know it today as GMH. The acquisition of Holden allowed General Motors to inherit an Australian, the formation of General Motors Australia Limited. So it inherited the brand and all its subsidiary companies. Throughout the 1920s, Australian Holden also had been supplying tramcar bodies to the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board. So it obviously inherited that business as well. It is at this point that we really should talk about the historic logo of the Holden brand being the lion. To answer where this design came from, we need to go back into the early 1900s. The Holden logo was a design from a guy called Ragnar Hoff. He was born in 1894. He was the son of a stoner woodcarver, so I was a little surprised that when Hoff wanted to do something with his life, that he began to study drawing and design, which was sort of a little bit of the family tradition at the time. Hoff saw some active service in the Second World War, the First World War in France. But he later immigrated to Australia in 1923 and took up a post as Director of Sculpture and Drawing at the East Sydney Technical College. At around about the same time, as we have discussed previously, in Adelaide, Holden's Motor Body Builders had a thriving business, and they were at the time fitting, as we discussed, their own car designs, in the late 1920s, to other manufacturers' chassis. So when the US giant General Motors entered the relationship with Holden in Adelaide to exclusively fit car bodies to GM vehicles, the new company needed a logo. So it was commissioned in 1927 to Hoff, actually, because he had such a renown and reputation as a sculptor, so renowned, and an artist. He was asked to come up with the design of the logo. A keen student of Greek art mythology, what Hoff did is he adapted the story of how the wheel was invented when the lion was observed rolling a stone. It was a perfect visual analogy for a car company, embodying the strength and grace of a lion with the invention of the wheel. The resulting design was applied to all Holden car bodies built from 1928 to 1939, and again when Holden, now a wholly owned division of General Motors, began reproducing cars in the post-war era of 1948. The design has been updated many times since then, obviously, but in essence, it is that of a lion rolling a stone, and this has remained unchanged throughout the decades. So obviously throughout the Second World War, the company stopped building cars pretty much. They aided in the war effort, but really nothing happened until about 1936, when the second full-scale car factory, which was located in Fisherman's Bend, Port Melbourne in Victoria, was opened by the then Prime Minister, and construction began in 1939 of a new plant in Pagewood, New South Wales. And it was during the war years that car production that was delayed, obviously, and efforts were shifted towards the construction of vehicle bodies, field guns, aircraft and engines, which GM and Ford both participated in. But it was as the war ended, the Australian government took steps to encourage the Australian automotive industry to really come up with designing an Australian car, something that we could call our own. Ford's proposal actually was the government's first choice, but required substantial financial assistance. So really that got put on the back burner, which was a surprise to me as well, actually. What happened was GM's study was ultimately chosen because of its low level of government intervention. Obviously, post-war, the government, the funds weren't sort of readily available, so the Holden, or GM's design, or GM's proposal, was the one that was chosen. So really after the war, Holden returned to producing vehicle bodies, this time for Buick, Chevrolet, Pontiac and Vauxhall. The Oldsmobile Ace was also produced from 46 to 48. But from here, Holden continued to pursue a goal of producing the Australian car. This involved a compromise with GM, Lawrence Harton from GM, he favoured a local design, while General Motors America preferred to see an American design as the basis for Australia's own car. In the end, the design was based on the previously rejected post-war Chevrolet, which is a little bit disappointing, but you can actually see in the Humpy, the FX and FJ, a lot of early Chev or post-war Chev design in it. So there's no surprise that's where it came from. The Holden was subsequently launched in 1948, creating long waiting lists extending through 1949 and beyond. The name Holden was chosen in honour of Sir Edward Holden, the company's first chairman and grandson of J.A. Holden, who we previously touched on before. Other names considered were the Gem, the Austral, the Melba, the Woomaroo, the Boomerang, the Emu and the Canberra. But subsequently the brand Holden was the one that was chosen, of course. It was really by the mid-1930s that General Motors Holden Australia had begun planning a full-scale local production, and especially once the war was over, and it shifted into gear as far as GMH, what GMH wanted to do with the Australia car. As we discussed previously, Ford was in there as well, trying to get its foothold in the door, but General Motors, Holden were the ones that were chosen to build Australia's first car. So really, GMH really after the war was the only one left with the ability, to make engines, chassis, vehicle bodies in house. Ford didn't have a production line as such. So in 1946, the company began work on what would become the first Holden car. It was known as the 48215, and this was designated as such as it was built in 1948, and there was a 2.15 litre motor. It was scaled down virtually, as I said before, of a Chevrolet that had been discarded. After testing in 1947 in the US in Detroit, it was ready for production by the end of 1948. It was in November 1948 that the then Prime Minister Ben Chifley welcomed the very first homegrown Holden and famously declared, "She's a beauty." The Holden went on to dominate the Australian car market for much of the next half century and shaped the nature's culture, accounting for up to half of all new vehicles sold in the late 50s, while remaining really at the top end of the sales charts throughout the latter part of the 1900s, well into the early part of the 2000s, and it was really up until 2002 that it became the nation's favourite car brand. Sadly, it'll reach the end of the road by 2020. That's just really 18 years after it was our last most popular. The initial range of the 48215 was relatively simple. It had one body style, one trim level, one drivetrain combination, which was a 60 horsepower 2.15 litre straight six backed by 3-speed manual gear shift with synchromesh only in second and third. The utility wasn't added until January 1951. In 1953, the business sedan was offered, and really this was more of an upmarket luxury version of the FX or the 48215, and it included such options as door pull handles, map pockets, reinforced seat cushions and padding, tougher floor mats, a handrail, aluminium kick plates, and it sold unbelievably well. It became known as the FX, and this really differentiated it from the FJ, which followed in 1956. Holden reached #1 position in the passenger car sales in 1950, so just 2 years after its inception, and it remained there, like I said previously, till the year 2002 at #1 position. The FX really was a really basic car. Door lock barrels are only fitted to passenger side. The early models ran 15-inch by 3.5-inch wide tyres. Later cars were upgraded to 4-inch wide. It's hard to imagine now, obviously, but even the side mirrors were an option. The only badges were really Holden letters on the front bonnet and Holden letters on the back bonnet. There were on the boot, as we call it. There was no blinkers of any sort. There was a central stop light. And at the time, obviously, everyone just used hand signals. The FXs were come in a variety of body styles and painted body styles. It had really not even any safety reflectors. These are all sort of applied later aftermarket, but they were never fitted by the factory. The station wagon was developed to prototype stage, but really never made it to production. There's been some post-market release of these wagons, but they were never really built by the factory. Australia really consolidated its market leadership with the FJ, selling a total of 169,000 units by the time the FE was introduced in July 56. So really, the FJ continued to be produced until the FE Ute was released in 1957. So they really ran alongside each other for a little while. When you look at these cars and you think that they're basic and they're underpowered, obviously in today's world that is definitely the case, being a little over 60 horsepower. But you need to understand that at the time the top selling car, at the time being in 1948 when the FX was released, the top selling car in Australia was the Austin A40. And this was a little cramped car, a bit too cramped for the average Aussie family, and had a feeble 4-cylinder in it. And it was only £31 cheaper than the Holden when it was released. So the Holden obviously sold like crazy because it wasn't that heavy, but it was fast for the price. It became, pretty much instantly a vital part of the Australian circuit and speedway scene, and just caused massive growth in the local market. So you could say that these old humpies were the great grandfathers of today's street machines, if you look at it that way. The two-tone paint started become available on the FJ specials only, and it was never available on the FX. The FX was really all just one colour, and I think, as I've said previously, the FX buyers only really had 4 colours to choose from, whereas the FJ offered 12. And the specials on the FJ also had chrome window trims, doorbell moulds, and the specials had door locks on both sides, on both doors, which was a sheer luxury for its day. The FJ became an instant classic. It had the bonnet bird was introduced as a factory offering. Windscreen wipers were vacuum operated. The FJ was fitted with torpedo-shaped tail lights and chrome wings, and it scored cool reflector housings, and it had a Holden special in script. The boot lid handle also was changed to an L shape from the FX's T. Number plate recesses were larger on the FJ than the FX, and a lot of interior dash fascia was changed as well, with the grille extended inside on the dash. The glove box had specials on it. Seat belts were now offered as an aftermarket accessory that were never an option on the FX. And really the clutch, brake and accelerator pedals pushed on both models, actually pushed downwards to the floor rather than the swing types that really we're used to in later models. Just some facts about the performance level of the FJ and the FX. The engine was a 2.15 litre inline 6, which is 132 cubic inches. It produced 60 horsepower, which is about 45 kilowatts. The transmission was a 3-speed manual column shift, and it did a 0 to 60 kilometres an hour, a 0 to 60, or 0 to 100 kilometres an hour in about 20 seconds, which is very slow. But like we said previously, at its time it was quite quick. Top speed of 75 miles an hour or 120 kilometres, which was incredible. The body styles were a sedan and utility. The price at introduction was £733. Without doubt, the most famous 48215 is its prototype number 1, which is now housed at the National Museum in Canberra. It is the only survivor of 3 hand-built prototypes manufactured by GM in Detroit. The 3 US-built prototypes and the 2 later Australian-built examples were registered as Chevrolets for evaluation purposes and driven over Australian roads, obviously. Once the new Holden was released, prototype number 1 was fitted with a new engine and sold to a member of Holden staff. It was later traded to a Victorian Holden dealer, and obviously worth a lot of money today. Some 40 years later it was restored, and then today it sits at the National Cultural Heritage Museum in Canberra. The 1950s saw really Holden consolidate its position, and it became a dominant force throughout the 50s and beyond of that, to the latter part of that century, achieving really number 1, like as we said, within 3 years of its existence, and held that that title for the remainder of the century. Just in sales, to get an understanding, the FX achieved around about 120,000 units sold in its time. The FJ 169,000. The FE, which came in 1956, achieved 155,000. And then the FE, which came in 1958, that achieved 191,000. At the time that the FE FC, which is a new body variant, came into existence, the Holden was offered in a sedan, wagon, utility and van. Prototype number 1 was hand-built in 1946 by American and Australian engineers at the GM workshop in Detroit, Michigan in the US. After months of durability and performance tests in America, and badged as Chevs at the time, 3 prototypes were shipped to Australia. Legend has it that the cars were driven under cover of darkness to Fisherman's Bend factory in Melbourne. There was a huge interest by the public for this car, and it was well known that Holden were well into design stages of and really starting to start assembly, which the first one rolled off the assembly line at Fisherman's Bend on the 29th of November 1948. Many saw the event as evidence of a national maturity and proof that Australia had escaped its really humble beginnings and embraced the modern industrial age. The 48 was, as we said, known as the FX, and was a robust and economical family sedan designed for the Australian environment and for the Australian people. It was unbelievable to conceive this, but the public reaction was so great that the sheer prospect of an Australian car had been so extraordinary that around 18,000 people signed up for a new Holden, to purchase a new Holden without even knowing a single detail about the car, the design, colour combinations, nothing. So that it was just the sheer magnitude of the local interest in the Holden. Pretty much instantly, the Holdens dominated the roads, and by 1958, which was the introduction of the FC, so that was 4 variants, including the FX after it commenced production, that sales of the Holden accounted for over 40% of the total car sales in Australia. A million had actually were to be sold by 1962 by the time the Ford Falcon was introduced, and another million was sold over the next subsequent 6 years. So it was incredible. As I said before, the car prototype number 1 was used as a test vehicle prior to the introduction or the release of the first car in 1948, and there was it just remained at the factory, and eventually sold to a Holden foreman by the name of Arthur Ling. He thought at the time it was just another car, and amazingly he traded it in Morwell on a new Holden to the Holden dealership in Morwell, Victoria, and it remained there for 40 years as a traded old FX, falling steadily into disrepair. In 1999, a Melbourne-based Holden enthusiast, Gavin Strongman, purchased the car and spent 12 months restoring the vehicle to its final pre-production form, which incorporated many of the progressive changes implemented by GMH during the testing phase. Once restored, the prototype was purchased by Ian Metherell, who sold the car to the National Museum in 2004, and there it sits to this day. So that completes the story of the FXFJ. It's foundation of how it all started, with Holden himself, and subsequently merged into the giant conglomerate known as General Motors, becoming General Motors Holden. As we stand today in the latter part of 2020, Holden has not been produced in this country now for about 3 years, and it's left a legacy behind, with a lot of people still having a piece of the brand in their hearts. So it's been a great journey, and I hope that you've enjoyed the contents of this video, along with some amazing shots of the vehicles involved, to really give an insight to the history of this great car, affectionately known as the Humpy, obviously for its round curves, and obviously known as the FXFJ to all. It had a great life on the track and on the roads, and there is many still today fully restored to the former glory, or restored and modified, as you can see in some of the images in this video. So I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the next episode.